Hey, I'm some nobody, and if you've never watched any of my videos, then you wouldn't know that I'm a really big fan of Yakuza. If you have seen any of my videos, I bring it up in every single video. If you think I can't bring up Yakuza 6 while defending Jake Mueller from Resident Evil 6, you are disrespecting me with that underestimation. You know, one of my absolute favorite things about Yakuza as a series is that if you go on YouTube and you look up any boss fight theme song, you are guaranteed to find at least one essay in the comments section that breaks down everything the boss stands for as a character. It's kind of what makes the series great, that something as simple as two guys ripping their shirts off and fighting can have so much depth to it and so much to analyze. Big respect to all my Kyodais and Kyodettes out there. For an internet fandom, y'all are all pretty media literate. Even the Fujoshis on Twitter who are only into the series for Old Man Yaoi tend to have a pretty good understanding of the game's themes. Quick sidebar, if you ship Kiryu and Majima and boil their relationship down to a simple physical attraction without acknowledging why Majima has so much admiration to Kiryu and how Kiryu saved Majima's life, you do not deserve to draw them kissing. Anyway, as I was saying, I think the Yakuza fandom is, comparatively speaking, pretty smart. Not me though, any document that's ever been filed on me has me listed as a moron. And as an absolute idiot, I love talking about power scaling. No offense to any other power scalers out there, I think it's the purest way that you can enjoy a character. Liking a character for their themes, motivations, character arcs, all totally valid, all very respectable. But equally as valid and equally as respectable is liking a character just because, damn, he just beat the fuck out of all the Z fighters. This man Broly walked through a Kamehameha, grabbed Goku by his face and said, "What was that, Goku?" And you notice he called him Goku, he didn't call him Kakarot. He rejected his Saiyanhood. He took his Saiyanhood, as a matter of fact. Point I'm making is that there's nothing wrong with liking a character just because they do cool shit. So I thought it might be a little bit fun to talk about these two interests of Yakuza and power scaling, specifically talking about power scaling in the Yakuza series. So I'm not going to be talking about how Kiryu can solo fiction with the Tiger Drop. I'm more going to be talking about within the world of Yakuza, like what makes somebody strong. So general spoiler warning for the Yakuza series and the Judgment series. I'm not going to be going into detail about anything story related, but I'm going to be talking about specific moments in terms of like feats. And I think the first thing I want to talk about in terms of Yakuza power scaling is a part of it that isn't too prevalent but is prominent enough to mention. Now, this might seem like a bit of a no-brainer, especially because it's part of real-life power scaling. Somebody with combat sport experience is going to be more dangerous than somebody who doesn't have any. But in Yakuza, just having combat sport experience doesn't actually make you that strong. Which isn't to say that training is meaningless in Yakuza, because it most certainly isn't. It's just that the training itself is not the most important power boost you can get. But it's worth mentioning because it will combine with the other power boosts to make you more dangerous. The most notable examples of this are Kuze from Yakuza 0 and Tendo from Yakuza 7. Kuze and Tendo are both former boxers, and what that translates to is that they are absolute killers in a fight, which puts them significantly higher on the totem pole than other characters, but they both have more prominent boosts, and they both lose to guys with little to no official training because of more prominent boosts. So again, having combat sports experience is not the biggest boost you can get in the series, but it is one worth mentioning. Now, as I was thinking about how to structure this video, I wanted to save the biggest power boost for last, but I quickly realized that I can't talk about some of the smaller ones without mentioning the bigger ones. So we're going straight to the single biggest source of power in the entire Yakuza series, and that is willpower. This is a series where if you are fighting for something that you truly want, truly believe in, if you are fighting for something that you are not going to budge or back down on, your physical strength will rise to meet the occasion. This is where Kuze's true strength was, because it was not the fact that he was a former boxer, it's the fact that no matter how hard he got hit, he would get back up eventually. The absolute best example of willpower boosting a character's strength to insane limits is found in Yakuza 3. After Patriarch Nakahara is kidnapped and taken to a bullfighting ring, he comes close to being gored until his formerly mute adopted daughter calls out to him. Saki managing to overcome her trauma-based muteness to call out to Nakahara Nakahara gives him the strength to do this.
Nakahara, なんだと？魂の久々に思い出したぜ。街で暴れ回った頃の自分をよ。
That is one singular example of a character's willpower causing a spike in physical power, but if you look at all of the strongest characters in Yakuza, they all have tremendous will. Of course, there's the main character Kiryu, a man who was willing to sacrifice 10 years of his life for his best friend without a second thought. And after those 10 years in the joint, Kiryu saw the path of darkness and destruction that Nishikiyama walked down and resolved to stop the man he sacrificed so much for. Then you have Saejima, a character who essentially gave up his youth and his dreams of living a normal life in order to take care of his younger sister Yasuko. Saejima joined the Yakuza because Yasuko needed a kidney transplant. Eventually, Saejima gets arrested just for counting to 18, and he spends 25 years on death row without losing his mind. And after 25 years, somebody finally gives him a good reason to break out of prison, and he does it about 1 or 2 days later. Starting at the age of 15, Shishido spent years fighting in literal death matches for his survival. Majima spent a year in the hole being tortured by Yakuza every single day and then spent the latter half of the 80s enslaved. Ryuji was neglected by his father and ostracized by his peers his entire childhood. These scenarios would take a tremendous toll on any normal person, but the fact that these men have survived these scenarios and come out the other side mostly okay is a true testament to their willpower. With all that being said though, we do have to keep in mind that willpower does not equal power level. It is still just a boost to your physical strength, which is why Saejima with his physical strength and willpower boost can stop a speeding car, but I do not believe Kiryu could do this. Though Yakuza 5 Saejima is Saejima at his most determined, so who knows if he could even do this again. I also have a theory that Kiryu's willpower manifests itself a bit more in his endurance rather than pure strength, but that's just a theory, so I don't want to delve too deep into it. The point I was trying to make is that Saejima with the willpower boost can stop a speeding car, but Saejima in infinite wealth sitting in a hut not doing anything with his life can get stopped by Sun-Hee, and no disrespect to Sun-Hee here because she is getting a big willpower boost protecting Kiryu, but any character being able to stop a Saejima punch is a little crazy. Like, I would still count this as a feat for Sun-Hee, but we have to understand this is not peak Saejima. This is a Saejima that is literally only fighting because he got called a bum. Understanding how willpower boosts work really explains a lot about Daigo Dojima specifically. Daigo has an absolutely atrocious win-loss record when it comes to 1v1s, and that's because more often than not in Daigo's 1v1s there is a huge difference in willpower between him and his opponent. When Kiryu fights him in Yakuza 2, Daigo's a little punk kid doing nothing with his life. When Daigo fights Ryuji in Yakuza 2, Daigo does okay against him, but he's not really fighting for anything important. He's just fighting because he's mad at Ryuji. Yakuza 4, he's broke as hell and all he's fighting for is money. And then in Yakuza 5, let's be honest, Shinada fans, Daigo could have won that fight if he wanted to. Daigo only forfeits because he could feel Shinada's willpower. If you're unfamiliar, it's a bit of a meme in the Yakuza fandom that base Daigo sucks, but Daigo parentheses Gun is one of the strongest characters in the series. And that's because despite his terrible win-loss record, anytime Daigo has a gun, he does something insane with it. And it's not a case of he suddenly gets good as soon as he has a gun. It's a case of anytime we've seen him with a gun, he has to lock the fuck in and his willpower spikes. I think if Daigo had to fist fight 1v1 to save Kiryu, he would surprise a lot of the haters. I don't think Daigo is top 5. He might not even be top 10, but I think a lot of people are sleeping on him. He hospitalized an entire baseball team solo once, so if we could get a spin-off game where you play as Daigo in high school, we'd finally get my man some respect.
Hey, how's it going?
So the power of friendship is a little interesting because it's really a case of willpower manifesting as strength once again. But it gets its own segment because it doesn't manifest the way willpower usually does. Ichiban is incredibly weak compared to pretty much every other main character in Yakuza. I'd put Ichiban around recurring mini-boss that you fight throughout a long battle. He's way above rank and file, but if we're talking individual power rankings, he might be top 15 at best. But Ichiban has a tremendous amount of willpower. He might have the most willpower out of any character in the series. You know, it's one thing to suffer and survive like the top guys I mentioned earlier do, but Ichiban suffers, survives, and smiles at the end. But Ichiban's willpower doesn't really manifest as a pure boost in strength, rather it draws people to him. People just can't help but like Ichiban, and if he has decided that you are his friend, that is when the power of friendship is going to start turning his willpower into strength. Not just for him, but for you too. Ichiban can't use his willpower to boost his own strength to an insane degree, but he can use it to boost his friends up, and then when his friends are boosted, they can boost him further. It's a crazy thing. Namba is the type of character that would get shit on by rank and file Yakuza, but the power of friendship has him going head to head with the 6th chairman of the Tojo clan. After Ichiban unintentionally teaches Kiryu the power of friendship, Kiryu is able to use it to temporarily overcome the cancer debuff. But despite the nutty capabilities of the power of friendship, it does not stack up to pure willpower boosting. When Ichiban and his friends fought a motivated Majima and Saejima, the best they could do was amuse them. Though I suppose there's an argument to be made that the Jima brothers were also using the power of friendship. And when they fought a motivated pre-cancer Kiryu, Ichiban got put on his ass pretty quickly. But in the interest of fairness, Ichiban's will was faltering at that time. Overall, I'd say that the power of friendship has a lot of potential, but it isn't pushing anybody into the top tiers.
はい、お釣り。
ああ、いや、いい。
マジで？やっぱりさ。
When most people talk about Yakuza power scaling, they're typically well aware of willpower boosting, but I very rarely see people talk about the power gap between civilian and Yakuza. It's a bit like the boost you get from the combat sport experience, where it is a bit of a no-brainer. Somebody who is a thug for a living is going to be stronger than a salaryman. I also should mention that when I say Yakuza, I mean current and former Yakuza, and when I say civilian, I mean pretty much anybody who is not a member of the Yakuza. You could consider this power gap the most prominent one in the series because it's the only one you can physically feel in gameplay. Regular non-Yakuza punks that you fight on the street are the easiest enemies to stomp out. And the street fights get a fair bit harder when you're actually fighting Yakuza members. A lot of sub-stories will involve run-of-the-mill civilians being terrorized by low-tier shitbird Yakuza. Yakuza's so low on the totem pole that their boss wouldn't even let them wipe his ass, and yet they're still so much stronger than a basic civilian. Now, it's obviously not a set-in-stone rule that any Yakuza would beat any civilian. If we look at things in terms of tiers, if we're looking at high tier, mid tier, and low tier, if the civilian isn't a tier above the Yakuza, they will struggle. Like a high tier civilian will beat mid and low tier Yakuza, but if they go up against a high tier Yakuza, you'll really start to see the power difference. Akiyama is probably the strongest civilian in verse. He is one of 2 civilians that has defeated Komaki. He's also one of the only civilians to become a legend of Kamurocho, respected by the Yakuza based on his feats in combat. Even when he is willpower boosted and teaming up with another decently strong civilian, Akiyama still gets laid out by Kiryu. There's no shame in losing to arguably the strongest character in the series twice. If we look at the caliber of enemy that Akiyama has actually beat, he really hasn't beaten anybody too impressive. His biggest win is defeating a bunch of Omi Alliance goons and a guy he had already beat 3 times in the center of Theater Square. Before that, his biggest win was beating a guy who was the captain of a subsidiary to a subsidiary of the Tojo clan. He beat the Amon clan twice, but the Amons have lost to every single playable character in the series. So I really don't think Akiyama would stand a chance against Majima, Saejima, or most of the final bosses from the Yakuza games. Now, if we jump to another civilian character, Shinada from Yakuza 5, he admittedly, in quotes, beats Daigo Dojima. I love this fight from a writing perspective, man. Shinada going all out, giving everything he has against Daigo just so Daigo will let him go to Tokyo, get involved in Yakuza 5's plot, and finally get closure on the dream that was taken from him. If you try and use this fight in a power scaling discussion, I am going to have to assume that you just skip the cutscene afterwards. Shinada does genuinely beat Baba though, a character that Saejima and Kiryu both low diffed. But Baba does give Shinada some battle damage and Shinada is exhausted after the fight. Now, I'm not trying to shit on Akiyama or Shinada or downplay their feats, I'm just saying I don't think a civilian character has ever come close to the high tier Yakuza members. And that's something that I think is true across the entire verse. It's not too much of a hot take for me to say that Yagami isn't touching most of the Yakuza characters. Personally, I don't think Yagami is stronger than Kaito. I would put Kaito and Yagami in the exact same spot in the Yakuza and civilian tiers respectively. I think Kaito and Yagami are both top of mid tier. I think both of them would be able to beat Ichiban in a 1v1, and I think Akiyama would be able to beat both of them in a 1v1. It's a position where both of them could get some wins over people in the higher tier based on willpower boosting, but they're not so high up that they can't be beat by anybody below them by willpower boosting. And I think with no willpower boosting, top of mid-tier Yakuza base Kaito would be top of mid-tier civilian base Yagami. And somebody's already probably typing up a comment, well, actually Yagami beat Kaito in the first Judgment game. Well, don't hit enter on that comment yet, gaming legend Big the Cat, because willpower boosting can explain that. Because the context of that fight is that Kaito is working as a bodyguard for an old friend of his from school. Yagami does some investigating and finds out that Kaito's old friend is a piece of shit. When Kaito isn't swayed by Yagami's findings, Yagami decides he's going to have to fight him. Kaito straight up says that Yagami has never beaten him in a fight, and then Yagami straight up says, I'm going to win this time through willpower boosting. And then after the fight, Kaito reveals that he kinda knew his old friend was a piece of shit the whole time and he was just wanting to give him the benefit of the doubt. So that means that during that fight, Yagami was willpower boosted because he believes he's protecting his friend, and Kaito was lack of willpower debuffed because he knows he's fighting for the wrong side. And going forward into Lost Judgment, all of the villains believe that Kaito is so much stronger than Yagami that Kaito is actually hard carrying Yagami in his detective career. So the villains in Lost Judgment are willing to go head to head with Yagami but prefer to ambush Kaito. So I do come out thinking that if Kaito and Yagami's willpower levels were equal, Kaito would come out beating him maybe 9 out of 10 times. I think the easiest way to explain Yakuza versus civilian in terms of power scaling is that the civilians are like humans in Dragon Ball and the Yakuza are like Saiyans. A human can beat a Saiyan. Cell Saga Tien could wipe out Planet Vegeta. Saiyans are born stronger and they can reach higher peaks than the humans. Now, I originally had this down as a boost, and I was going to use it to mention why Tendo's boxing background isn't the biggest power boost he has. But a dragon on your back really isn't a boost at all in the Yakuza series, it's a benchmark. Dragons are pretty much the most powerful creatures in Japanese mythology, so if you want to get one tattooed on your back, you gotta earn it. Because if you decide to get a dragon tattoo on your back without proving you got the physical strength to carry it, your ass is not becoming a legend dog. You will be forgotten in the Yakuza world. So that means that anybody with a dragon tattoo that's actually achieved anything in the Yakuza is a real force to be reckoned with. You know, Saiyans in Dragon Ball Z, when they're born, they're put into different classes based on their power level at birth, and you can kind of look at tattoos in Yakuza the same way. The type of tattoo you can get is decided on your power level when you first become Yakuza. All this talk about power scaling makes me want to power scale. Let's talk top 5. So you think that pre-cancer Kiryu would be an easy number 1, but it's really not the case. In his defense, he is undeniably stronger than everybody in the franchise except for one person. Kiryu has never beaten Saejima without an asterisk. When they fight in Yakuza 4, Saejima is still recovering from being lost at sea, and Kiryu isn't really fighting to win, he's fighting to test past Saejima. Even though you get Kiryu's health bar down to 0, it winds up being a draw. When they fight in Yakuza 5, neither of them are injured and they're both fighting to win, but it winds up being a draw again. Since you choose who you play as in this fight, you can't even argue that one of them had the upper hand before the end of the fight. Then when they fight in Infinite Wealth, Kiryu has cancer but the power of friendship. Saejima is living without purpose. It's a 5v3. You really can't count this fight as a win. So we wind up in a situation where we have pre-cancer Kiryu and man on a mission Saejima both in the number 1 spot. But if Saejima is tying for number 1 with Kiryu, what does it mean when Shishido overpowers him and Majima at the same time in Like a Dragon Gaiden? I talked about this in that video I made on Shishido way back then, but this might be the craziest feat in the entire series. Shishido loses to Kiryu right after this, so this doesn't change Kiryu's ranking, but does this moment move Saejima out of the tied for number 1 spot? There'd be some merit to it, but I'm going to say no, simply for the fact that, like I said, Kiryu has never beat Saejima. So does this moment guarantee that Shishido is in the number 2 spot? I say that is entirely dependent on how you interpret Memoir of a Dragon number 53, A Man Named Ryuji Goda. Kiryu says that Ryuji was powerful, more so than anyone he has ever faced before. If you take that as Kiryu in Infinite Wealth saying Ryuji is the strongest guy he ever fought, then Ryuji's number 2, no question. It's also a weird thing to say considering he beat Ryuji but he's never beat Saejima. But if you lean on the word before here and you take that to mean that Ryuji was the strongest guy Kiryu had faced up until that point, things get a fair bit more complicated. Are we dealing with DBZ style power creep where you can say Nagumo low diffs Ryuji? I'm just going to take this as Kiryu saying Ryuji is number 2 here. So we got Kiryu and Saejima at number 1 and Ryuji at number 2. Who's number 3? I've mentioned Shishido enough that you'd think I was building up to him being in the top 3, but he isn't. Because despite Shishido's insane feat and despite the battle damage he put on Kiryu, he did lose to him and Kiryu was left standing tall. I gotta kneel to the Mine stands on this one. He's the only one who left an uninjured, unshot, unstabbed Kiryu looking like Shinada. Now, I think this top 3 consisting of 4 people is mostly inarguable. Pre-cancer Kiryu at number 1, let's be honest, that's Kiryu, dog. Saejima has never been shown to be anything less than Kiryu, so I didn't feel comfortable putting him at number 2. Those two share the number 1 spot. Mine fans won't like that I put Ryuji over him, but if you got an issue with it, take it up with Kiryu. I'm just going off of his words here. Then I just put Mine at number 3 because you can't deny he did put Kiryu through the ringer. 4 and 5 were way harder to pick than the top 3. I ultimately came to the conclusion of Majima for number 4. Majima is a bit like Daigo in that, objectively speaking, he does not have a great 1v1 win-loss record, but Majima really only loses to Kiryu and Saejima. Now, there's no shame in losing to the 2 strongest characters in the franchise. Majima does have a lot going for him. There is only one thing that makes me a little hesitant to put him at number 4. That's his performance in Yakuza 5 where he manages to get kidnapped. Part of my brain is screaming at me that that should knock him out of the top 5, but I gotta play the Kaito defense and say that they ambushed him. Not to mention that they were threatening Haruka's life, and even though they had been torturing Majima for a while, he's still able to put up a pretty good fight with Saejima on top of Millennium Tower. I'm also investing in Majima here. I'm sure Pirate Yakuza in Hawaii is going to give him some crazy feats, and this number 4 spot is going to get locked in easy. Number 5, this is the absolute hardest position to pick. Part of me wanted to go with Shishido because of his one feat that's absolutely nutty, but there is a character who fought Kiryu and didn't shoot him first, didn't stab him first, didn't injure him in any way before he fought him, and still gave Kiryu a hell of a fight. This might be a sleeper pick and a bit controversial, but I'm going to say the 5th strongest character in the franchise is Nishikiyama. You could argue that maybe Kiryu collapsed because of a mental or emotional exhaustion, but I do think Nishikiyama gave him a hell of a fight. There were so many emotions running between these two, and Kiryu had to fight so hard that afterwards Nishikiyama did a complete 180 on his turn to darkness. You know, we often talk about how when these guys rip their shirts off, that's them bearing their souls to each other. They're going all in on a fight. They're going balls out. Nishiki's balls, his desire to climb the waterfall and become a dragon, did drop Kiryu to his knees. But unfortunately, a willpower boosted Nishikiyama lost to Majima in the 80s, so I have to put him below Majima. You could maybe make the argument that Majima and Nishiki should be higher than Mine, but I think Mine did what Nishiki did without any emotions between him and Kiryu, really. But I'm going to say that that is my personal top 5 strongest guys in the Yakuza series. Kiryu and Saejima tied for number 1, Ryuji at number 2, Mine at number 3, Majima number 4, and Nishikiyama in the number 5 slot. It was honestly harder than I thought it would be. I don't know how long it would take me to fill out the rest of the top 10, but I think that's about enough of me talking about power scaling aimlessly.